On the 25th of February 1957, in a wooded lot beside Susquehanna Road in the Fox Chase neighbourhood of Philadelphia, a boy of about 5 years old was found in a cardboard carton. He had been wrapped in a cheap flannel blanket. He was clean. His hair had been cut recently, and cut badly, in the way a hurried adult cuts a child's hair at a kitchen table. His fingernails and toenails had been trimmed. Somebody had looked after this child, at least in the ordinary daily sense of the word, within days of him being left in a clearing off a road in a city of 2 million people. And in the 65 years that followed, through the largest search the Philadelphia police had ever run for a child, not one person in that city or any other came forward to say they knew his face. No parent, no neighbour, no teacher, no doctor, no landlady, no aunt. Nobody reported him missing, because as far as any record in the United States was concerned, there was nobody to report. This is the ground we are going to cover tonight. First, the clearing itself, and what the physical evidence actually offered, because the objects in this case have been examined more closely than almost any set of objects in American criminal history. Then the search, what the police did in 1957, at a scale it is genuinely hard to imagine a department attempting now, and why every part of it failed. Then the two men who carried the case privately for decades after the department had moved on, and the theory one of them chased to the end of his life. Then what finally answered the question in 2022, 65 years later, and what it cost to get there. I am not going to describe how he died, beyond saying that the medical examiner ruled it a homicide, because the how is not what this case turns on, and the child is entitled to better. What this case turns on is a much stranger question: how does a living child leave no trace at all? The man who found him was Frederick Bonones, a student at La Salle College, and the way he found him is part of why the case began late. He had been in the lot some days earlier, checking on rabbit traps he had set, and had seen the carton then. He did not look inside, or did and said nothing, and told nobody for several days, because he had also been watching the girls at the reform school on the other side of the trees, and did not want to explain what he had been doing there. When he did finally speak to a priest, and then to the police on the 25th, a patrolman went out to the lot and found the box exactly where it had been left, at the edge of the clearing, a few feet from the road, in plain sight of anybody who walked along it. Those few days of delay cost more than they look. The lot was open ground in February, and the box and its contents had been rained on and frozen and thawed before a police officer ever saw them. There had also been at least one other person at the box before the police. A man who was trapping muskrat in the same lot had noticed it some days earlier, looked inside, and decided to say nothing, for much the same reason as the student. Two people saw a carton with a child in it and walked away from it, and the reason in both cases was that they did not want to explain their own presence in a wood beside a reform school. A crime scene that has been opened to the weather and visited twice before it is reported is a poor scene, and every conclusion the pathologist drew about how long the boy had been there had to be hedged accordingly. The estimates ran from 2 days to 3 weeks, which is another way of saying that the single most useful fact for tracing a child's last movements, the date, was never established. Everything the investigation had was in that clearing, and it is a remarkably small pile. There is the carton itself, a shipping box for a bassinet, the collapsible kind sold for a baby to sleep in. There is the blanket, flannel worn thin of a common weave, recently laundered and cut roughly in half with the cut edge unfinished. There is a man's corduroy, cap blue, found some distance from the box in the same lot. There is the clipped hair, some of it still on the blanket. And there is the child himself, who carried no clothes, no shoes, no toy, and nothing at all in the way of an identifying mark that could be written on a card and circulated. The medical examiner's file recorded the estimate that everything else rested on: white male, 4 to 6 years of age, 30 pounds in weight, 40 inches in height, malnourished. He weighed 30 pounds. That is light for 4 and very light for 6, and the pathologist noted signs of chronic undernourishment alongside the recent bath and the recent haircut, which is a combination worth pausing on. It suggests a child who was being fed inadequately over a long period by somebody who nonetheless bathed him and cut his hair. Those two facts do not resolve into a single picture of a household, and they never have. The report also noted surgical scars, including one that suggested a hernia operation or something similar, which meant that at some point in his short life this boy had been inside a hospital, seen by a surgeon and written down. That last detail is why the physical evidence looked so promising in 1957 and why its failure is so complete. A scar from an operation means a record. A record means a name. Philadelphia detectives went to the hospitals with the description and the estimated dates and found nothing that matched, and they did the same across the surrounding counties. The city also did something extraordinary and characteristic of the period. They fingerprinted the child and they took his footprints, and then they compared those footprints against the inked footprints taken from newborns in Philadelphia hospitals. Detectives checked every birth record filed in the city for the relevant years, an exercise involving something in the order of 200,000 certificates, done by hand, by men reading paper. Every one of those checks came back negative, and every one of them was correct, which is the part nobody could see at the time. There is one more detail from the examination that has shaped every theory since, and it can be stated without dwelling on it. Loose cut hair was found clinging to the body and inside the blanket, which told the pathologist that the haircut had been given very shortly before or, more probably, after death. That single observation changes the meaning of everything else about his appearance. The trimmed nails, the clean skin, and the cut hair are not necessarily evidence of daily care at all. They are consistent with somebody preparing a child to be found, tidying him, cutting his hair, wrapping him in a blanket, and putting him somewhere he would be discovered rather than somewhere he would not. Whoever left that box beside a road in plain view a few feet from a clearing did not behave like a person trying to make a child disappear. They behaved like a person who wanted him found and did not want to be the one who found him. The objects were traced with the same thoroughness. The carton was identified as the shipping box for a particular bassinet sold by the J.C. Penny chain, and detectives worked backwards to a store in Upper Darby. The store had sold 12 of that model in the relevant window. It kept no record of who bought them, because in 1957 a shop selling a bassinet for cash had no reason to write down a name, and 11 of the 12 buyers were eventually accounted for. One was not. The cap was traced further still, to a shop where the proprietor remembered making it, and remembered the young man he had made it for, a man with blonde hair who had come in without a woman and had asked for a strap to be added to the back. He could not name him. The trail on the most promising object in the entire case ended with a shopkeeper's memory of a stranger's hair color. The search that followed was the largest the city had run for the identity of one child. Recruits from the police academy were put in a line and walked the lot and the surrounding woods on their hands and knees. Divers went into the creek. The city checked its own institutions, its foster placements, its charitable homes, and its orphanages. And then the department did the thing this case is still remembered for locally. It printed a flyer with the child's face on it, reconstructed and cleaned up by the medical examiner's staff, and had it inserted into the envelopes of the city's gas bills. The flyer they printed asked one question in large type: "Do you know this child?" 400,000 flyers went out with the gas bills, into effectively every household in Philadelphia that had a gas supply, along with the description and a telephone number. The photograph on that flyer is worth describing, because it tells you how hard the department was thinking about the problem. You cannot circulate a photograph of a dead child to 400,000 households and expect anyone to recognize him from it. The face is wrong in ways people cannot see past. So the medical examiner's staff dressed the boy in ordinary clothes, sat him upright in a chair, opened his eyes, and photographed him as though he were a living child sitting for a portrait. The result is unsettling to look at now, and it was the correct decision then. What they were trying to produce was not a record of a body, but a picture a woman might glance at over a gas bill and think, "I have seen that boy in the street." It is the same reasoning behind every facial reconstruction since, and it is the reason his face, rather than his case number, is what Philadelphia remembers. Consider what that flyer campaign actually was, because it is the strongest single piece of evidence in the case, and it is a negative. A photograph of a small boy's face arrived, unavoidably, Inside the monthly bill of 400,000 households in one American city, thousands of people telephoned. Every serious call was followed up. Not one of them produced a household that had lost a child, a school that had lost a pupil, a doctor who had lost a patient, or a relative who had stopped hearing from a sister. He had lived somewhere for 4 or 5 years, eaten at somebody's table, been bathed and clothed and taken to a surgeon, and when his face was placed in front of an entire city, the city did not recognize it. So here is the question that sits underneath this whole case, and it is the one I would genuinely like your view on, because it decides how you read everything that follows. A child cannot live for 4 or 5 years without being seen, by neighbors through a window, by a delivery man at a door, by the woman at the corner shop, by somebody in a waiting room. So was this a boy deliberately kept out of sight by the people who had him, hidden from the world on purpose? Or was he simply never entered into any of the systems that make a person visible, and so passed through 5 years of ordinary life as somebody no institution had a reason to notice? Those are two very different explanations for the same silence, and the evidence in 1957 supported both. I will tell you at the end which one the answer turned out to look like. The case did not go quiet so much as it changed hands. Officially it stayed open, and the Philadelphia department never formally shelved it, but the men working it retired and were replaced by men who had other cases and a duty roster. What kept it alive for 4 decades was 2 private obsessions, and later, 1 organization. Remington Bristow, an investigator in the medical examiner's office, is the first of them. He had been at the autopsy. He worked the case privately for the rest of his life, at his own expense, and by the time he died in 1993, he had spent 36 years on it. He kept the death mask in his office. He traveled to conferences with it. He interviewed people the department had never got to, and he built up a file that was, in the end, considerably larger than the official one. And he did something that a modern investigator would be criticized for, and which was not unusual at the time. He consulted a psychic in New Jersey who described a house, and Bristow then found a house that matched the description, a foster home about 1.5 miles from the clearing. That foster home became the center of his life. The family that ran it had, he learned, held an estate sale, and among the items at that sale was a bassinet of the type the box had contained, and blankets similar to the one the boy was wrapped in. Bristow's theory was that the boy was the child of the family's unmarried stepdaughter, kept out of sight for that reason, and that the death was an accident concealed to avoid scandal. He pursued it for 30 years. The department looked at the family more than once and found no evidence to charge anybody, and the theory has never been proved or disproved. It is worth being fair to Bristow here rather than treating him as a curiosity. He was not wrong about the shape of what he was looking for. He was looking for a household with a reason to keep a child unrecorded, and that is exactly the kind of household this case was always going to end in. The second man is William Flesher, a former federal agent who had helped found the Vidocq Society in 1990 with a forensic psychologist and a forensic sculptor. The society took its name from a French detective, Eugene Francois Vidocq, the convict who became the first chief of the Paris Short, and it is an unusual organization, a membership of forensic professionals who meet over lunch in Philadelphia and take on unsolved cases at the request of the agencies who hold them for nothing. The boy in the box was the case they adopted as their own from the beginning. Members paid for a headstone. Members attended his reburial. For 30 years, the society's meetings kept the file in front of people with the skills to work it at a moment when the skills that would eventually solve it did not yet exist. That is the part of this case that is easy to miss, and it is the reason the ending was possible at all. Between 1957 and the 1990s, nothing that anybody did could have identified this child, because the method that identified him had not been invented and the data it needed did not exist. What the intervening decades achieved was not progress towards a solution, it was preservation. The file was kept, the objects were kept. The remains were kept in a grave in a potter's field, marked eventually with a stone paid for by strangers. And keeping a thing intact for 40 years until a technique arrives is a form of investigation that gets no credit, and in this case was the whole of the difference. There was a third theory in circulation for years, quite separate from the two the private investigators favored, and it deserves a mention because of what it says about the limits of the search. Fox Chase in the 1950s sat near open ground that traveling carnivals used, and a persistent idea held that the boy belonged to a family of itinerant workers who had passed through and moved on. It is an attractive theory precisely because it explains the silence. Nobody local recognized him because nobody local had ever seen him. It also explains nothing else, and it cannot be tested, and it has the shape of the explanation people reach for whenever a town does not want the answer to be one of its own households. The department chased what it could of it and got nowhere, and the reason it lingered for 50 years is that it was unfalsifiable rather than that it was strong. In 1998, the boy was exhumed. The purpose was DNA, and the exhumation was carried out with the Vidocq Society's involvement and the medical examiner's consent, and a tooth was taken for analysis. What came back was mitochondrial DNA, which is inherited down the female line and is enough to exclude or to link within a maternal family, but is nowhere near enough to identify an individual against a database. The sample was degraded. The boy was reburied at Ivy Hill Cemetery under stone reading, simply, America's unknown child, and a small group of police officers and society members attended, some of them elderly men who had been young patrolmen on the line that walked the lot in 1957. There was one more twist before the answer, and it is the one that shows how difficult a case with no anchor really is. In 2002, a woman came forward, referred to publicly only as M, who said that her mother, who was abusive and mentally ill, had bought a small boy from his parents in the summer of 1954, kept him in the basement, called him Jonathan, and that he had died in 1957 and been left in the lot. She gave detail, she named the location. Investigators took her seriously, and several of them believed her, and the story was consistent with the physical picture of an undernourished child in a household that had a reason to keep him hidden. It also could not be corroborated at any point that mattered, and other parts of her account did not hold up. So it sat there for 20 years as the most detailed account anybody had ever given, and one that could neither be used nor dismissed. What finally worked was not a new witness, a new confession, or a new object. It was a different way of asking the same question of the same material. Investigative genetic genealogy compares a DNA profile not to a police database of offenders, but to the public databases where members of the public have voluntarily uploaded their own results while researching their family trees. The comparison does not look for a match, it looks for cousins and for how distant those cousins are. From a set of third and fourth cousins, a genealogist builds their family trees backwards to the common ancestors, then forwards down every branch, until the branches converge on one household that could have produced a child of the right age in the right city. It is worth understanding why that method did not exist before about 2018, because the delay was not technical. Consumer DNA testing became a mass activity in the 2010s, and millions of people uploaded their results to public sites in order to find relatives. The investigative use of those databases arrived properly in 2018, in California, when a decades-old series of offenses was closed by building family trees out of distant matches on a public site. That case changed everything and also started an argument that has not finished, because the cousins whose data made the identification possible had uploaded it to find a grandmother, not to assist a police department. The main public database now requires users to opt in explicitly before law enforcement can search their profile, and a majority have. Every identification made this way rests on that permission, freely given by people who will never be told which case they helped close. Colleen Fitzpatrick, a physicist who had moved into genealogy and had helped build the discipline, was among those who worked the case, alongside the Philadelphia police, a team at the medical examiner's office and other genealogists. The technical problem was severe. The material was 60 years old, had been buried twice, exhumed twice, and previous testing had already consumed part of what there was. Modern sequencing needs a great deal more of it than the mitochondrial test did. The work went on for years without a public word, and the remains were exhumed once more in 2019 to obtain a better sample than the one taken in 1998. On the 8th of December 2022, the Philadelphia police held a press conference and gave the boy his name. His name was Joseph Augustus Zarelli, and he was born in Philadelphia on the 13th of January 1953. He was 4 years and 6 weeks old when he was found. The certificate had been sitting in the city's own records the whole time. Joseph Augustus Zarelli, born 13 January 1953, in the city where he would be found 4 years later, in a lot 2 miles from the address on the form. He had a mother whose name was on it, and a father whose name was on it, and a family that had gone on living in and around the city, while 400,000 flyers were delivered with his face on them. An identification is not a solution, and the department was careful to say so. The homicide file remains open, and the detectives working it now have something no investigator had in 1957, a household, an address, a set of relatives, and a life to reconstruct. They asked publicly for anyone who had known the family in the mid-1950s to come forward, which is an extraordinary appeal to make in 2022 about a household in 1957, and it is a reminder that the people who might answer it are now in their late 80s and 90s. Whether that question is ever answered is largely a matter of arithmetic. What the identification changed is the shape of the problem. For 65 years, the case had no starting point at all, because you cannot investigate the death of a person you cannot name. Every inquiry had to begin from a cardboard box. Now it begins where every ordinary inquiry begins, with a family, and it happens to begin 65 years too late. 65 years and 9 months separate the two dates, the finding and the naming, and that gap is the case. The detectives of 1957 checked the birth records of Philadelphia and did not find him, and the reason they did not find him is not that the record was missing. They were searching for a child who had been reported missing, or for a child whose birth record had no corresponding trail, and they were reading 200,000 certificates for a match to a description of a body. His certificate was among them. It simply did not announce itself, because a birth certificate looks like every other birth certificate, and there was no one anywhere in the system saying that this particular child had stopped appearing. The police said at the press conference that they knew who his parents were, that his mother had since died, and that the investigation into how he died remained open, which is why very little more has been said publicly about the family. They did release that he had older half-siblings, that some relatives were still living, and that some of them had not known he existed. And that is the answer to the question I put to you earlier, or as much of an answer as we are likely to get. It was not a boy stolen and hidden by strangers. It was a boy inside a family, born in a hospital, written down properly, who then dropped out of every system that might have looked for him, in an era when a child could do that without anybody committing a crime to make it happen. If you subscribe, it genuinely helps us keep making these, and there is a new case every day. And if there is a case you have always wanted looked at properly, leave it in the comments, because that is where most of these start. The headstone changed too, and for a case that spent 65 years without a name, that is not a small thing. The stone at Ivy Hill that had read America's Unknown Child was replaced in 2023 with one carrying his name, his date of birth and the date he was found, paid for and arranged by the same people who had paid for the first one. The old stone was not thrown away. Both are at the grave, which is the correct decision, because the anonymous one is part of his history now. It records 65 years during which a city looked after the grave of a child it could not name, and strangers left toys at it on his unknown birthdays. The account M gave in 2002 also has an ending, and it is worth recording plainly rather than leaving it hanging. The identification is not compatible with her story. Joseph Zarelli was born in a Philadelphia hospital in January 1953 to parents whose names were on his certificate, which does not fit a child bought from strangers in the summer of 1954 and kept unnamed in a basement. Investigators who had believed her for 2 decades were, in the end, chasing a story that did not describe this boy. That is not a criticism of them. It is the ordinary hazard of a case with no anchor. When there is nothing solid to test an account against, a detailed and internally consistent account will always look like the best thing you have. It is worth being precise about how a child becomes invisible in 1953, because it is not mysterious and it did not require a conspiracy. There was no national identifier for a child. Enrollment in school began at 5 or 6, and he was found at 4. Vaccination records were held by whoever administered them. There was no federal missing children system of any kind until 1975, and no national center until 1984. Reporting a child missing was a matter for whoever cared enough to walk into a police station, and if the people who had the child were the people who would have had to make the report, no report was going to be made. The certificate in the city archive was the only official statement that Joseph Zarelli existed, and a certificate does not check on you. The identification also settles one of the long arguments about this case, and it is worth stating plainly. For decades, the leading theories were both about a household that had reason to hide a child, the foster home Bristow chased, and the account M gave of a boy bought and kept in a basement. Neither was the answer. The truth was more ordinary and, to my mind, sadder for being ordinary. He was a member of a family that had him, that knew he existed, and that let him vanish out of the record without anybody outside the household noticing that anything had changed. Bristow spent 36 years being roughly right about the shape and wrong about the address. There is a wider number worth knowing, because this case is not an outlier in the way people assume. There are something over 14,000 unidentified people held in medical examiners' and coroners' offices across the United States and entered in the national database, some of them from the 1950s and some from last year. They are not unidentified because nobody is looking. They are unidentified because the same problem applies in every one of those cases. An identification requires a link between a body and a record, and a body carries no record with it. Genetic genealogy has closed hundreds of them in the last decade, and it is closing more every month, and its supply of new answers depends entirely on how many living people choose to upload their own DNA to a public database and tick the box permitting law enforcement to search it. So what does this case actually teach, 65 years after the box was found and after everything in it was examined to exhaustion? 3 things, I think, and none of them is about the crime. The first is that physical evidence answers only the questions it was ever going to answer. The box was traced to a store. The cap was traced to the man who made it. The blanket was analyzed to the weave. Every object in that clearing was worked to the absolute limit of what 1957 could do to it, and all of that produced was a shortlist of 12 bassinet purchasers and a shopkeeper's memory of blonde hair. The objects could describe the world the child came from. They could not name the household, because a household is not a physical trace. The second is about the value of keeping things. Nothing between 1957 and 2019 identified this boy, and yet the identification would have been impossible without almost every part of that interval. The file that was not destroyed, the tooth that was recovered in 1998, the remains that were reburied rather than lost, the objects retained in evidence, the society that paid for a headstone. There is a version of this case where a mid-century police department, out of leads and short of storage, quietly closed a file on an unidentified child, and the answer became permanently unavailable. That version is the normal one. It is what happened to most of the 14,000. And the third is about what a name is for. Nothing about Joseph Zarelli's short life changed on the 8th of December 2022. The identification does not comfort him, and it does not undo anything. What it does is remove him from a category. For 65 years he was a case number and a phrase on a headstone, and the phrase, America's unknown child, was kind and was also a description of a whole. A name puts him back into the ordinary human record, born on a Tuesday in January, in a hospital, in a city, to 2 people whose names are written on the form. That is all a name does, and it took a physicist, a police department, a lunch club of retired investigators, 3 exhumations and the family trees of strangers who will never know they helped, to give him one back.